Okay, so I'm going to call the WSESD meeting to order at 6:01. The meeting of the WSESD will come to order. This meeting is a hybrid meeting, which means that some or all of the public body is meeting remotely, and some are meeting physically in a previously noticed location, where the public may attend to observe, listen, and participate contemporaneously. Please note that while we will strive to provide means for those attending remotely to participate in the public comment period, there may be technical difficulties or reasons that otherwise prevent or interrupt remote public participation. Therefore, it is important to note that the open meeting law only ensures that the public's right to participate and comment at a public meeting by attending at the designated physical location as posted in the notice and agenda. If a member of the public or of the public body has technical difficulties accessing this meeting remotely, please alert us by email. In the event of a technical difficulty that cannot be resolved, we may continue the meeting if necessary to time and date certain. Please note that all votes taken during this meeting that are not unanimous will be done by roll call vote in accordance with the law. So now we will go to, actually I need to make a motion to amend the agenda for 3 different items. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. All those in favor of amending the agenda, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, so I need to first off take off the number 4. And that will be postponed till the next meeting. Let's see. Tim has something you want to...
Yeah, I'll present it now.
well, no, if you want to just let us know why it is we're amending the agenda.
We received no applicants for these 2 student rep positions on the board. So I'm going to speak to a motion to amend the process for selecting student reps.
Okay. And then I don't know if this would go into the admin report, but Deb Gass has something that she needs an application bring to the board. So those are the items. So now we will go to the consent agenda. Is there a motion for the approval of the minutes for May 3rd and May 10th?
So made.
Thank you, Tim. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Deborah. All those in favor of approving the minutes from May 3rd and May 10th, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. So now we're going on to number 3, pupil waiting, and Emilie Komheiser is here to make a presentation to the board and the public. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I think there are people on Zoom as well.
Yep.
Okay.
They're over there.
Great. Hi, people. Not sure who you are, but glad you're there. So I have been, the legislature has been working on the issue of pupil waiting very diligently for about a full year, but in various iterations for the last maybe 4 years to a decade. And I'm here specifically to talk about S287, which is a piece of legislation that I co-chaired the task force on and then was the lead for in the House. But before I get to that, as sort of the first legislator to meet with you all since the legislature adjourned last week, I just want to say that we also passed a lot of other significant legislation that will impact the school district and our communities, and want to name a few, though there are many. So universal school meals passed. I know we already have universal school meals in some of our Brattleboro schools, but not throughout the district. And so that's a really exciting win for all of our communities. In conversations with Mark and Frank, was able to make a few tweaks to that bill to make sure that it was really significantly meeting the needs of our school district. It hasn't been signed yet, but it's on its way.
We were asked if you could speak up just a little bit.
Ah, yes. No one ever asks that of me, so I will. I will try.
Move
And-
the mic.
The mics are the
That's the Zoom mic.
That's the microphone. You can just speak towards the microphone. It'll pick you up fine where you're sitting right now.
It's cheap
Okay.
now, Mark.
Great. And in addition to that, we passed a new grant program with a focus on mental health supports for both students and training teachers and staff in really significant mental health attention, basically, is probably the easiest way to phrase it. I know that's something that we've all been talking about in this district for at least a decade. I think we're pretty far ahead of the pack statewide on that issue, but really a renewed focus on it and helping the Agency of Education focus on that issue as well. So that's a really exciting COVID response, if nothing else. And then a lot of thinking about career technical education and our career centers, both how they're funded, and that's going to be a work in progress, to we have some sort of reverse incentives built into a lot of our funding. But funding for this year and a really renewed look at how we can ensure that students are thriving and that they're that education is valued on par with all of the rest of education that we offer in our schools. So that's a really exciting thing. We also, passed significant work on opioids and family supports and housing and all kinds of other things that are going to significantly change the lives of folks within our school district and the kids in those school districts, including some changes to the child protection system. But those are sort of the big wins for schools that I have off the top of my head, though there were many more that went through. And I believe that a number of other legislators from our regional delegation are on the Zoom call tonight, and I'm really happy that they could join us.
Emilie, was the mental health bill, was that 13 million? Do I remember that?
I do not have that number nor the bill number in front of me, but it was a fairly significant investment. It's all new money. And it came out of actually the Pupil Weighting Task Force, which I'm going to talk about, had a series of recommendations. Most of them went into S287, but a few of them were split off into other bills, and that was one of the other bills that we know that a lot of the cost of creating an equitable educational opportunity for our kids in our schools is related to trauma and mental health, and this was a specific way of meeting those needs. So S287. I'm going to do a little bit of a history way back machine, and then would like to talk about sort of the specific case of Windham Southeast. I came to the Finance Committee some point in the last 6 months. I have totally lost track of all time and space. But to talk about some of the issues more in depth, that was before the bill had passed. It's now passed both the House and the Senate. It passed the Senate unanimously, and it passed the House with all but a few members voting for it, which is sort of the House version of unanimous. We always have a few no's. And what essentially we did was we have this one piece of our education finance system, which is incredibly complex, which is the student weights, which essentially accommodates the fact that in order to create an equitable educational experience for our kids, it costs a different amount in different schools depending on the makeup of that school body. But I want to talk first about why we have the system that we have, because it informs why we are where we are, which is very different than any other state in the entire country. And I think it's important to remember that and to both celebrate that and then sort of see what the next step is from that. So Vermont's commitment to equitable access to education is actually enshrined in our state constitution. And that is very unusual. So when Act 60 passed in the Vermont legislature, and when the Brigham decision was decided in the 90s by our Supreme Court, there were lawsuits that were similar to the Brigham lawsuit all across the country. And in Vermont, they were found against the state because we have this equitable access to education enshrined in our state constitution. And so at that time, what that meant was it was decided that relying almost entirely on local property taxes to pay for our education system is unconstitutional, because it means we'll have such drastically different experiences for our kids from community to community. That still happens all over the country, as I'm sure folks know. And the reason that we changed it was because of this Brigham decision in Vermont. And what that did was pooled all of our education funding into one statewide education fund, which is very, very unusual. But we kept our local control, because that is a core Vermont value: town meeting, local school boards, participation. We have, I think, less curricular decisions decided at the state level than I think also almost any other state in the country. So we really leave those curricular decisions up to our school boards, up to our administrators, up to our teachers, while saying that the responsibility for paying for all of these things sits at the state level. And the responsibility for equitable education sits at the state level. And so in order to sort of meet that kind of wild balance of complete local control and statewide funding sources, we levied property taxes across the state, and we sort of balanced that outlay of property taxes across the state using something that we call the common level appraisal. That was one of the tools that we used, so that districts were sort of contributing to the statewide education funding pot, not by sort of how much they needed raised on a local level, but on how much money they were actually able to raise based on their grand list. And we let the grand list, we also sort of equalize those grand lists, not just by sort of the value of those properties and how properties were valued and at what time, but we use something called a common level appraisal, so that if one community is sort of locally being appraised at 1 year, everyone's sort of tax rates can balance out, because we can't appraise all the properties all around the state all at one time. So there's that piece that equalizes the education funding. There's the fact that we're all paying into a common pool that equalizes the education funding. And then there's the piece of weights. So the common level appraisal and the statewide education fund is how we account for the fact that there's different wealth in different communities, right? And then we add these student weights to account for the fact that different students cost a different amount of money to educate. When the weights were put in our original education funding formula with Act 60, they were not derived scientifically, and they were actually the weights that were carried over from a previous formula that was essentially a grant-based formula. And that's what every other state in the country uses, is basically, except for Hawaii, which is this grant-based formula to equalize education. And they attach weights to that. So in 2019, after a lot of pressure from communities all around the state that said, this isn't working for us the way it is. And it was a really pretty fascinating coalition of districts who had been sort of struggling since Act 60 with how much money they might be paying in, and districts that experienced high poverty rates that maybe couldn't vote the budgets that they wanted. And then communities like ours, which isn't really either of those things, right? We tend to approve our budgets. We tend to have some of the higher spending in the state. We have a community that's incredibly supportive of our budgets. And we're a community that did not necessarily suffer particularly under Act 60, but was sort of in the middle of the pack of that. But we're a community that's deeply committed to equity in education and to our schools, and so wanted to see a funding formula that worked. And so our community sort of jumped in. And part of my work in the legislature was to be carrying this work forward. So this study in 2019 that was carried out by UVM researchers, and I know that different people have sort of probably read different pieces of the big old pile of links that I sent you all, but I'm not going to assume that everyone read all of the links, because I don't think any of us are that diligent in this world. I certainly am not. So I'm going to try to do a quick summary of it all. So in 2019, that UVM study that was contracted from the Agency of Education concluded that the weights don't adequately account for all the different costs from district to district of educating different students, and recommended a series of new weights, as well as some other changes to the funding formula. And so I'm summarizing lots of time and lots of work here, but that study then turned into a task force that looked at those weights and then looked at the other recommendations in the task force, from the study, and made recommendations around what legislation should look like that turned this academic study into real policy for our state. And so what that looked like was implementing a series of new weights, changing the way we measure poverty, changing pieces of the formula to make it sort of more rational. And then looking at a number of other administrative details. So implementing the weights in a single year, because this is going to be a pretty massive change to our education system. Creating a short-term tax throttle to support communities that are going to experience a significant change in their tax rates. Attending to certain aspects of how we count students. Different districts have a really different ability to count the students in their care, both in terms of their poverty rates and other things. And so really attended to that because that's a really serious disparity. If we are moving tax capacity, if we're essentially saying, based on the number of students in this category you have, this is what your tax rate will look like. We need to make sure that the number of students that we're counting for setting those tax rates is accurate. And so we spent a lot of time talking about essentially how we count the students, and I think that's a really important conversation I want to have here tonight. And then in the interest of sort of clarity, we also suspended the excess spending threshold, and we suspended the ballot warning language. And so that's a conversation, those two pieces are conversations I'd like to have with you all over the next year or two as we look to reinstate mechanisms that might be similar to that to make sure we're doing it in a way that meets the needs of our district. Now we're doing all of this, we're really shifting significant tax capacity around the state. So previously the weights were quite small. And while they sort of would shift tax capacity slightly from district to district, it wasn't enough that districts could really feel the impacts. That's why we made the change. These new weights, which are much more significant, are really going to shift tax rates all over the state. And we're doing that, and we're creating that level of really significant disruption at the scale of Wscsd in our communities because we believe, as the Brigham decision ruled, that spending and the ability to spend is the greatest tool that the state has to equalize educational opportunities. I don't believe that it is the greatest tool that we all have as communities, as community members, as teachers, as administrators, as elected officials. I don't think that's the greatest tool we have for equalizing educational opportunities, but it's the greatest tool we have at this state level, because at the state level is where we control the tax rates and the tax capacity. It's at the district and the community level where we control administration and curriculum and what happens in the classrooms, and you all have been doing a lot of great work on that. But there's this assumption built into this massive overhaul that we're doing that we're going to create equity across our state for educational opportunities, that a kid's birth, family, and economic circumstance is not going to change their test score, basically. That a kid from a wealthy background and a kid from a poor background can come out of the school system with the exact same test score. That is a big, old assumption to be making. And that we can do that just by spending, by shifting our tax capacity. So that's the assumption that's built into this legislation that we passed. And so because that's a pretty huge assumption to be making, we also are looking at how can we sort of, what's the next stage in making that work? So we strengthened our education quality standards to ensure that the Agency of Education is actually showing up at the table to work with our districts to implement best practices, to support districts, to do the best work that they possibly can, and to create the most equitable outcomes that they can in schools, in districts, in communities, on boards, in classrooms. 5 years out from this implementation, we're going to create a pretty comprehensive evaluation to say, okay, we moved all this money around, did it make a difference? We put a number of other studies into the bill to continue to ensure that we're asking questions about opportunity, and particularly we put in a lot of accountability around English language learners, which it was very clear to us had been really deeply left behind, well beyond the funding issue, but really at a curricular level with many of our communities who didn't have very many English language learners. And so we also added a supplemental grant for English language learning in our schools, and that is something that I believe Windham Southeast will be eligible for. It's a specific grant that's for districts with a smaller number of English language students. So in Windham Southeast, it looks like because of all of these changes, because of this increase in a weight for poverty, because of a massive increase in the weight for English learners, because of a new weight for rural school districts and for small schools, because of a new weight for middle school. It looks like because of all those changes and the way the poverty weight is actually structured and the way that we measure poverty, it looks like because of all of those things, we will likely see a reduction in our tax capacity. That means that if you all and our voters decide to spend the same amount of money, that our tax rates will go up. The modeling that we did is based on 2020 demographic data. It's based on 2020 tax rates, it's based on 2020 spending, and it's based on sort of an assumption that nothing will change between what happened in 2020 and into the future. I absolutely recognize that it's not the way the world works. It's just the best way that our fiscal staff can model the future, because they can't account for all of the differences that might happen. But that is what it looks like. The legislation has a tax throttle built into it, so that the district, any district that's experiencing this reduction in tax capacity, will have 5 years where their tax rate will be deeply protected to not increase by more than 5% a year, while any adjustments are made. And this next year, if the governor signs the yield bill, tax rates should go down quite significantly in order to further help districts prepare for this transition. And so what I'd love to talk about for sort of the rest of the time that I'm here is basically why that is what it is, because I've worked in our community quite a bit in human services. I've consulted for the school district in a private capacity. I understand, I live here, and I understand that is not what any of us feel like our school or our district is. I think we all experience the struggle of our students. I think every person who works in our schools has had probably the hardest 3 years of their life. The idea that we could possibly be better off than anyone else in the state right now is really, really hard to get our heads around. It was incredibly hard for me to get my head around. And as we were working through statistical model on statistical model on statistical model with the task force, I kept on just like bumping my head against a wall to say, like, how is this possible? Given what I know about my community and what these weights look like, and what I think I went into this work assuming would happen for our community and what did happen for our community. And so I'd love to sort of talk about all of that after answering any questions that you might have, or I can just jump into that part, if that's helpful.
Well, at some point, I wanted to see if Frank had a response for the, because you're the money guy in the district, and so I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond if you wanted to. If you felt that you were prepared for that, and if now is appropriate, then that's great. If
I think it'd be helpful to hear the rest of your thoughts, and then we'll pull it all together.
okay, thank you.
Thanks, Frank. So two of the changes that we made that were recommendations in the original pupil weighting report from the researchers was to move from one way of measuring poverty, which is under current law, we measure poverty for the purposes of pupil weighting and not for the purposes of anything else in our entire education system, by the number of kids in a district whose families receive food stamps, SNAP benefits, 3 squares. No one really knows how that happened or why that happened, and in fact, many sort of AOE administrators didn't even know that that was true until we sort of picked up this conversation. They just knew they got a poverty number from TCF every year. The recommendation in the report was to move to free and reduced lunch as a way of measuring poverty for the purposes of pupil weighting. That was the recommendation of the UVM researchers because it's considered nationally a more reliable indicator of poverty. In Windham Southeast, and in Brattleboro particularly, we have fairly high rates of enrollment in our, not of enrollment, but in uptake. So the reason that food stamps is not a very quality measure of poverty is because a lot of folks who are eligible for food stamps don't sign up because there's shame and there's paperwork, and if you live in the Northeast Kingdom, you have to drive for an hour to get to the office, and all of those reasons. In Windham Southeast, and particularly in Brattleboro, we have fairly high uptake rates of food stamps compared to our population of folks who are living in poverty, because we have a community with like slightly less shame attached to poverty. We have grocery stores and a community that's done a lot of work to make using food stamps easier and more accessible. We have farm stands that accept food stamps here. And we have a district office that's right downtown that's easy to get to. And we have fairly good broadband access compared to some other areas of the state, though it is very, very, very far from perfect. So our gap between the number of people actually living in poverty and the number of people accessing food stamps is fairly small compared to a lot of other areas of the state. But using food stamps as a way of doing that creates major geographic disparities and is not an accurate measure of poverty. So we looked at all these different ways of measuring poverty. All consider poverty 185% of the federal poverty level, which is the level that you're eligible for free and reduced lunch. It's the level that you're eligible for food stamps, the level you're eligible for a whole bunch of other stuff. And the report recommended free and reduced lunch measures. We used that in our sort of final modeling. That is what brings me to you to say we'll likely see a tax rate increase if our spending stays the same. But what we moved to sort of the next step of is using a universal income form, which is what our district has been using since we started universal meals, universal lunches here. Some districts around the state use it, some districts around the state don't. So if we use free and reduced lunch for some districts, and then we have other districts who don't collect free and reduced lunch data and in fact collect a universal income form, we're gonna create more geographic disparities. And so we're asking the entire state to move to this universal income form, which will be simpler than the universal income form we're using now. And Mark actually connected me with the front desk team at Green Street to say like, what's really, really hard about getting families to fill out these forms? And we had a great talk, and we're putting together a working group, the Agency of Education is, that will have front desk staff at that working group. We'll have experts in measuring poverty at that group. We'll have administrators there to move towards this way of measuring poverty. However, thanks to conversations with Frank, realized that because our uptake rate on food stamps is really good compared to our level of poverty, and our uptake rate on free and reduced lunch form filling out, because we had universal meals for quite a while and parents didn't have an incentive to fill out the form, was pretty low, we were one of the only districts in the state that actually had a free and reduced lunch level that was below our food stamp level. And so, as we're implementing the universal income form, I know this is like so deep in the weeds, but it's like a really important part of why our numbers are weird.
Hugely.
As we're implementing the universal income form around the state, we're gonna set a backup rate. So if a district has their direct certification rate, which is food stamps plus a few other things, higher than their universal income measure of poverty, then the rate for that district will default to the direct certification rate. And when that happens, it will also be a flag to the Agency of Education that that district needs some more help with their data collection. So that's really important for us who might have a really high uptake rate on direct certification, which is food stamps and a few other things. It's also really helpful for some other districts around the state who might tuition their students, and including Verdon, who in tuitioning their students just didn't quite realize they needed to collect this paperwork from their students. And so we have some other districts around the state that just like have super duper low poverty levels no matter how we measure it, because they haven't been collecting data on their students. And so that will create a sort of mechanism for them too. So that's one reason that our numbers are the way they are. Another one that's sort of the difference between my lived reality, I think all of your lived realities of working and living and caring in this district, is that we changed the composition of the poverty weight. So under current law, poverty is everyone living in poverty at 185% of the federal poverty level or below, and all of the ELL students. there are people who do not speak English as their first language who are not living in poverty. It's a really weird bias that got carried over from some decisions some random legislator made in 1994, or maybe even before. No one again has any idea where that came from, to put those two things together and have an ELL weight. And so when we pulled the ELL students out of the poverty weight and had them entirely in the EL weight, that caused the researchers' analysis of how high the weight for poverty should be to go down. Because there were costs that were wrapped into that original poverty weight that didn't need to be there anymore because they would hang out in the EL weight. So when we made that decision this last summer, it caused the recommended poverty weight to go down and it caused the recommended EL weight to go up. So that was one thing that happened. We also, in this district, don't receive the rural weight and don't receive the small schools weight because our district is densely populated enough. The sum total of the district is densely populated enough that we're not considered a rural, like we don't experience the impacts of the increased costs of a rural district. And we don't have a small school in a rural district because we don't have a rural district. And so that means that there are districts in the state that either have a high poverty rate and a very high EL rate, like Burlington or Wscsd, or have a high poverty rate and a rural and a small school weight, like the Northeast Kingdom, most of the districts in the Northeast Kingdom. And so because all of our education spending is equalized across the whole state, those districts that have multiple weights, like Burlington and Wscsd with both the EL weight and the poverty weight, or the Northeast Kingdom with the poverty weight and the rural weight and the small schools weight, they all wind up with way higher weights than we do, with essentially just the poverty weight here. So our poverty numbers are probably underestimated, and our poverty weight is the only weight we have, and so compared to other districts, our total weight is lower than you might expect given our lived experience of struggling here. And so that is why the numbers do not come out the way we might all expect them to, living our lives and knowing what we know about our community. And I will stop there and answer any questions that you might have. And also, if it's appropriate, invite my colleagues to jump in and say what
I would first
Yeah.
like to give Frank an
Yeah.
opportunity.
Sure. Thank you. Well, fortunately, we spoke at length in our finance committee and then when you came in. So a lot of my questions have been addressed, and the real humdinger was seeing a substantial, like 15% projected reduction in our area tax rates, or $1.70 where we are, which is the upper third of the state on average. The UVM study had us coming down to $1.50 at the same level of spending, which means the same level of support for all of the interventions that we are very proud to have done and got great results. But then Emilie has just, I think, done as well as anybody could do to explain the mechanism that no one could explain, and I often challenged it myself. How do you assign a 0.13 weight to a high school kid when they have to take driver's ed and there's all these other educational programs, there's cooperative ed. None of that made sense, and yet again, this explains why, as Emilie just said, when you put a rational kind of equivalent to a weight and the cost of meeting a student's need, we come out differently given we are not particularly rural. And so that, along with the ESL, is just, that explains why it's not what the UVM study originally published in 2019. I guess my only question is the timeline of when we do get to see how the agency evaluates this this policy change in the context of results, in the context of students learning and student growth being supported. Because obviously, prior to the pandemic, we really had great success in Brattleboro. We're some of the poorer communities, and yet our assessments around student growth is as good or better than most of the state. And we've all slipped since the pandemic. But is there a timeline, and can, we would like to, of course, support anything we can do for those measures and essentially the accountability for this.
Yeah. So I want to be clear before I answer that question that I think it's possible that what's modeled as part of us developing this legislation does not come to pass. So our demographics here are different than they were in 2020. We have a lot more EL students than we did then, and we'll likely have more. I think our poverty rates might be higher than they were then, though I could be wrong. And again, I don't think that what got modeled is an accurate measure of poverty here in Windham Southeast. And so it's possible that with all of those changes, what actually winds up happening in 2025 when this is fully implemented is not what we are predicting it would be from the model. These are just models based on holding things steady that might not stay steady. And so I want to be clear about that. And I think there's a lot of chance that it won't quite come to pass, though I want everyone to be ready for it to come to pass, because a surprise like this is not a good surprise, which is why it's been so important to me to come here and talk about all this with everyone. The evaluation that happens in 2029 or 2030 is going to be about saying, checking in again, are these weights right? They need to be recalibrated regularly. One of the reasons that we're experiencing this intense disruption is we've been using these weights for 20 years without ever calibrating or recalibrating them. And part of the recommendation from the original study and part of the recommendation from in the legislation is that the weights get recalibrated every few years and sort of tuned up so that we don't wind up having this level of disruption in 20 years again. And then we'll also have this evaluation in the 2029, 2030 to say, did it make a difference? And if it didn't make a difference, there's going to be new legislative will to say, okay, what else do we need to do? Maybe what we actually need to do is both equalize our tax capacity, but also think about what adequate spending floors might look like, because we don't have those in Vermont. Or maybe we need to have some direct grants to support really intentional curricular activities that we know make a difference. And Larry Pikus, who wrote that study 5 years ago, that where Brattleboro and Windham Southeast was really held up as an example of doing great work to create equity and make a difference for kids, has been sort of continually part of these conversations as we've moved on. And what he's been saying continuously before that report and since that report is, in Vermont, it's not that we don't spend enough on our kids, it's that we are not spending our money on the right things. And we were held up as an example of spending our money on the right things. Where the money is spent has nothing to do with S287. It's just how much money it's not even how much money we're spending, it's how much money a district could spend for its tax rate. And so I hope that regardless of what happens here with S287, with the tax capacity and the tax rates, that I know that Brattleboro voters and Windham Southeast voters are going to continue to support our schools and our school budgets, because that's what we do here, because we care about our kids and our teachers and our staff. And that all of the really incredible curricular work that happened and will happen to recover or continue through the pandemic, or whatever word we use now about the pandemic, will keep on happening. And I think the attention that we're paying to that now as a state, rather than just at the district level, I feel really hopeful that that's going to make a difference to support you all. You know, in my paid work with the district than in my legislative work, it's been really incredible to me to learn how little the Agency of Education is able to provide our districts in terms of like best practices or supports, and that you all are just like on your own sharing best practices with each other. And so I'm hopeful that even before the evaluation happens, that this increased attention on equity and quality will be sort of carried forward.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily, and
Yeah.
thank you, Frank. I do have to be mindful of the time, and as much as I would like to let, we could probably go on for the whole rest of the meeting. So what I'm gonna say is that for anyone looking for the video of the Finance Committee meeting that was on April 12th, and it is on the SD website under the minutes if they want to go and watch that. And maybe we might, not sure if any of the board members have questions that we can just spend a couple minutes on, if that's.
I just have one quick question. You did mention the spending cap, and it sounds like that's going to be suspended going forward.
Mm-hmm. The excess spending threshold and actually the ballot warning language, which we, with mandatory ballot warning language, both of those are suspended through the full transition period. So right now they're suspended through 2029. What we're going to be having conversations about in the legislature between now and 2029 is what are appropriate ballot warning language that actually supports districts to get the best results, and what is an appropriate mechanism for cost control that actually works, rather than the excess spending threshold that just seems sort of as more of a stick and less of a carrot. But they are going to be suspended until 2029, and I would really appreciate regular conversations about what tools people think might be more helpful in the future.
Michelle, did you have a question?
I probably have a bunch, actually. And I was thinking about the spending threshold too, because that's something that drew my family to Vermont, because it creates protection around an affluent community just spoiling their one little school and spreads it out. So I guess I missed that it was temporary, that it would be suspended temporarily, and that's to kind of create a wiggle room for us to figure it out and to cut programs and as needed and whatnot is really what we're talking about, I think. I think as I'm getting it right. So I know I had from my notes from when you presented in the Finance Committee that the evaluation would be thorough and would include school climate survey and risk surveys and graduation rates. Is there consideration, and I guess this kind of connects to the AOE piece, to have a starting point? Because I think some of us would laugh the idea that we're not rural and that we're not small schools when we have schools with 120 students, but I understand big little Vermont. But I think about, we have offset of different issues. So we have our special education. We are chronically, as far as I've ever been aware of, so understaffed that we are outsourcing and paying other, outside of our district because we don't have enough staff. And when you look at our student outcome, we struggle in that area. And I have to think it has a lot to do with not having the right staff in this area. So we still face some of these struggles of rural living. Is that on the radar to be thinking about that and offsetting some of those ways that we're hurt? Because that's what worries me, is that we're going to see more reduction without considering some of our special needs because we're making these so blanket categories.
Mm-hmm. So I want to be clear that the state's not reducing anything. Local districts pick their budgets the way they want to pick their budgets. And then those taxes are raised statewide. It's just that there's sort of the link between our school budgets and our tax rates. And for anyone watching at home, I know you all know this, the majority of Vermonters pay based on their income. They don't pay based on their property. And there's a lot of energy around increasing that, so more and more Vermonters are paying based on their income, so we have sort of more money in the pool. The determination about what is rural and what is a small school was not made by the legislature. It was made by the UVM researchers, and what they looked at was what is the point of rurality on a scale of 0 people per square mile to 500 people per square, whatever numbers, where they see a difference between outcomes and spending. Okay, so that was their statistical research. So they're the ones who picked the cut points about what counts as rural and what doesn't count as rural. There are other states all around the country that have sort of determinations of what's rural that actually nothing in Vermont would count as, or everything in, Wyoming's rural weight, I don't think anything that we do counts as rural there. And all of our schools count as small in other places, right? But the UVM researcher were the ones who created those cut points about where the impact was. Because we definitely, as legislators, love to stick our fingers in everything. And we had a moment where well, I don't know if that really does count as, just like you're saying, or maybe everything counts. And we started to maybe try it, and then we're no, once we start playing with these numbers, we're taking away the sort of academically derived validity of the numbers. And so we cut ourselves off with the pass on that one. On the excess spending threshold, the idea of having the Statewide Ed Fund really does, I think, in some ways lower the incentive for one special little school to put all of these resources that other students can't access, because any spending in a district does get sort of, just like any tax rate increases in a district, does get spread around the state. And so other districts with less wealth pick up the wealth from the wealthy district spending. But that can get a little wild and impact other communities. And so that is why we're looking at other tools for cost containment. It's just that the excess spending threshold doesn't work as well as it could. And historically, the communities that were impacted by the excess spending threshold were often not communities that are what you might imagine would be the super precious ones.
Okay, very quickly, Sean, because we're gonna move on.
I recently learned that 2/3 of property owners in the state of Vermont receive some degree of income sensitivity. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so 2/3 of folks in Vermont who pay education taxes pay based on the amount that they pay is based on their income. When we passed the yield bill, we set an income rate and we set a property rate. And 2/3 of Vermonters pay on the income rate, not on the property rate. We're having conversations. This summer, there's a new task force, and we've been having conversations for a decade about what it would look like for everyone to pay just an income rate and no one to pay a property rate. But that's another whole big old policy lift that I'd be happy to talk about. And we can look. I have a file somewhere that actually can tell us how many folks in each of our surrounding towns pay based on income versus property, if that's interesting at all. I can forward you that file.
Okay, thank you. I think, as I said, I think we could talk about this, all night.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are people in the public who have questions, and maybe they can send you an email.
I am very easy to find. It's Emilie Komheiser, and if you Google my name, I'm the only Emilie Komheiser in the whole world, and so you won't wind up in the wrong place. And any of the email addresses you might find there all work to get in touch with me, but ekornheiser@ledge.state.vt.us is the best one, though it is the hardest to spell.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
So now we're going to move on to the public comment on non-agenda items. We're gonna spend 10 minutes on that. I'm going to ask that people keep their comments to 2 minutes or less, so we can let everyone who wants to make a comment do so. Anyone making a comment can expect a response that falls into one of the following categories. Receive an acknowledgement of the comment with no further action planned. Receive an immediate response from the board chair or administration. Administration would be directed to contact and respond to the person. Clarification sought from the administration for a specified meeting. The topic would be added to a specified future board agenda. The matter would be referred to an executive session, or a public hearing would be held on the matter. Is there anyone in the Zoom who has a question?
Not yet. Probably there is. Yep, Jody Normando.
Okay, Jody.
Hi, Jody Normando from Dummerston. And tonight I would just like to thank Sean and Tim and Frank and Gary for getting the Finance Committee where Emilie and Sarah were at. up so I could watch it. And as good as our minutes are, or your minutes are, because your minutes are very good, it's still quite a bit different to watch what's going on and be able to see it as well as having the minutes. And I really appreciated it. And I would say, you know, I hope this continues, especially if there's something of interest in the Finance Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Anyone else in the public have a comment on non-agenda items?
Not yet.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one more time and then we're gonna move on. Public comment on non-agenda items. Okay, we are going to move on then. So we are going to move on to unfinished business, and the first thing on there is the sexual abuse investigation update. David?
Yeah, once again, there is very little that we can say. We have conferred with Kendall Hext, our attorney, who is supporting the investigator and supporting the superintendent legally in this process. We've conferred with her on what we can share without jeopardizing attorney-client privilege, which is obvious. I think everyone knows how important that is. At this point, we, the board, are receiving no information about the ongoing investigation, so we don't have anything to say, even if we just don't have anything to say. And the investigator and the attorney are editing and reviewing a statement that we hope to be able to share in the near future that can give some broad outlines of what's happening and what's taking place, and some of the choices the board has made in terms of support in finding professionals to support the work. And other than that, we're so far removed from it, we really can't say anything without getting in trouble. So they're working on a draft or on a statement that hopefully we'll be able to share in the near future. But again, it's going to be very limited because our primary concern is protecting confidentiality, and when injunctions and court cases start, attorneys have ways of breaking through that, and we have to be very careful that we don't leave any of those doors open so that people's privacy and security is jeopardized.
So I will say, some of this is what David already touched on. We are balancing between the public's need to understand what's going on and their desire to make sure that the process is moving forward in an ethical way. But we're also balancing that with, to the extent that we actually have any of the information, but we're balancing that also with the need to assure confidentiality for any of the reporters. So I think it's important for the public to understand that if we've assured people confidentiality, we have to honor that. And so, thank you, David.
And Mindy has her hand up.
Mindy.
Hi, thank you. Mindy Haskins-Rogers, BUHS alum. And I just want to clarify, so the attorneys are drafting a statement. Is that going to be an update on the progress of the investigation, or just to clarify the roles of the different people involved at this point? I'm not sure. I was trying to understand exactly what you're saying. And then also, in what role is the superintendent participating in this at this point?
We don't know what is going to be in the statement. So we can't answer that, and the superintendent is providing is serving the administrative role, the executive role of the school district in terms of carrying out our personnel policies and any other policies that come into the mix.
I see. So at this point, there are personnel decisions being made. Is that what you mean, or personnel actions being taken?
I'm not aware of any personnel decisions being made now. But we don't get information. We don't get those updates, and the people that do, I'm certain, can't share them.
And so does the superintendent receive information that's more sensitive?
I have not. I have been providing access to requests by the investigators.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for clarifying.
Yep.
Thank you, Mindy. So, the addition of the student representatives to the board, I'm going to put that down under the unfinished business because that is unfinished business from a previous meeting. So Tim, you're up.
So I'll get right to it. I'm moving that we change the process of selecting 2 student reps to extend the deadline to May 31st and to also allow rising seniors to apply. Because none of the students applied by May 10th. And I understand from Mike Sostak that there are seniors who are interested who feel that they can very well do the job. So my motion is to amend the process to extend the deadline to May 30th and to allow seniors, rising seniors to apply.
Yeah, Tim, I think I mentioned this to you, and I just wanted to bring it up again. When you mentioned that nobody, I didn't realize that, well, I know about the seniors now, but you mentioned nobody had applied, and a lot of it was because they didn't want to have to commit to 3 hours of meeting. And so I think what we might want to do is have the committee meet with the administration and see if there are ways that we can adjust our agendas to do the kinds of work that we want to be sure we have student voice involved in early in the evening, so that they can do that and then do their homework.
That's an excellent point, and Lana and I talked about it when the students are interviewed. We're going to make it very clear what the expectations are.
Yep. And if you don't, I mean, if you know that we're going to do the business that matters to you folks in the first hour or the first 90 minutes, and,
right.
But again, we have to see if that's manageable, if we can work that out. So
Makes sense.
And
there's another meeting in the process.
And at the very most, it would be 2 2-hour meetings per month for 9 months, which is 36 hours, and that can be applied to their community service requirement, which is 30 hours. So it works out pretty well.
Yeah, I just want to point out, that's what we offered Deborah and Lana too, when they came on the board, and how'd that work out? The other thing we talked about, well, go ahead, Michelle.
Well, I was just going to say, I can actually remember, and I wonder if we have it on a webinar, would still be available. I think it was a year ago, a joint training with the superintendent, and we covered student voice, and there were several districts who had regulated, they had student, like it was their time on the agenda, and it'd be interesting to go back and just find out what those districts were doing and what their process looked like, because they had the best success, is what I recall, from who shared what, was those students who came in for a specific time with an objective to share, and they weren't asked to sit and listen to budget conversations.
So maybe Wendy could put in the minutes that to remind me that we'll look for, those are on YouTube, and gradually the SBA can find them again. They just found the first one from last year for me, so they are available. We can find them. It took a few months, but
They're coming in handy, right?
And I would add too, at the LC last night, the BUHS LC, we discovered that making an announcement before spring break to students is not a good idea.
Good, also. Is there any room?
They have all spring break to make their application, but no, their minds are not on.
I'm wondering if there's any room to have a stipend for a student participant, because honestly, by 11th or 12th grade, most students would have their community service. That's not necessarily gonna, be a motivation, but I wonder, we receive stipends to offset our time and efforts. I don't know, I should be looking this way, really. Frank, is that even something conceivable? Is there like any rules around that? Is that something that could be found?
I don't know.
Or out of the board budget, or?
I don't know if there's precedence for that. Are you aware of anything?
There is not certainly at the board level, but yeah, there are student stipends that have been administered. So it
They
is.
wouldn't be able to get into the service hours though if they get paid.
There you go. So it's one or the other.
Yeah, I bet you they would choose the money.
Okay, so Tim has made the motion.
Tim's got some work.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so all those in favor of Tim's motion in regards to the adding the seniors to the student representatives to the board. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
An observation, our Zoom board members have become just like soldiers now and getting unmuted and
Oh.
time for notes. It's like bang, 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 and these names pop up and the mics are on.
That is great, thank you. Okay, so now we're gonna go on to committee assignments, and I think we have pretty much gotten the assignments done, but I guess I would take this opportunity to just say, to encourage the different committees, if you have not met, to please consider communicating and trying to meet, see if you can do something to help create some stuff for the board. So, thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Well, I was just saying that encouraging the committees to try and meet and start doing.
It might be, you might want to see if we can get someone to volunteer to be a convener to make that happen, so that there's actually a person who contacts the people in the committee. So you don't have to do it or anybody else.
Are you saying you?
Sure, for the policy committee, I'd be more than happy to contact everyone and see when we can meet.
Okay.
Right.
Do we need to do that for the other committees?
Otherwise, it might not get done. So it would make sense to do that.
Can you just repeat what you want us, what the,
Well-
I guess I messaged you what the goal is?
Essentially, the purpose of each committee, I'm encouraging the members to get to communicate and schedule a meeting to start doing the work of that committee.
If they haven't, and if they don't, then
If they haven't.
they can decide that. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Makes total sense since we
do we
reorganized.
need to go through and set someone, or can we try to do that amongst ourselves and then at next week's meeting, just kind of report back as whether we were successful at that?
Maybe if there are people, any members who feel like there's something that the committee should meet and talk about what they should do or shouldn't do, that they could take responsibility for convening it, for contacting those people. Is it on the website yet, the new list?
I don't think so.
So we would need for that to happen pretty quickly.
Okay.
Could you see if Mark could get that up?
Yes,
Get the
Emily.
website updated for the sheet?
So for this question, I might have missed something, but I can definitely organize the PPEC, who hasn't met in forever. But I was just wondering, was there a time when new committees were assigned? I might have been
No,
late.
I sent out a few emails asking for people to let me know which ones they wanted to be on, and at the last meeting, I believe there was we talked about it, but I'm not sure that you were at the last meeting. So if you want to just send me an email on which committees you would like to be on, stay on, join, whatnot, then I'll make sure that that gets on the list. And I'll confirm whether I actually sent that to Barbara.
Okay.
If not, then I will send it to her.
It hasn't been updated.
Okay. So just, Emily, if you can just send me an email and let me know, I'll add you to the list on the committees that you want to be on. Thank you. Okay, so anything else any other comments on the committees? Are we good on that? Okay, I'm gonna call it good. So administrative report, guess you're up now.
Okay. Keep it fairly brief tonight. Middle of May, we're in the last home stretch of the school year. This last month is always like the final sprint to the finish line. There's so many things going on. And what's nice about this spring is that all of our schools are really getting back to their end of the year traditions. Those events are now happening again, where all of us are there together. Families are back on campus again, celebrating student successes. So at all of our schools, those traditions are coming back, and that's been really inspiring to see. And I think it's been really healthy for all involved. Major focus this spring continues to be on hiring. We still have openings, and all administrators and teachers and committee members of those committees are very busy with the hiring process. I'd like to give just a basic update on the recovery plan, and then some follow-up meetings as we conclude this school year, maybe dig a little deeper in some of the items. So 3 of our core goals in the recovery plan are centered around MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, EST development, educational support teams, and diversity, equity, and inclusion development and work. Happy to say we've made really nice progress in all 3 areas this school year. In terms of developing multi-tiered systems of support in our schools, that's been a focus at our admin meetings, and our next meeting, the first Friday in June, will be kind of sharing out and reporting out with each other and collaborating with each other the development of our master schedules over time. Because the master schedule that you develop for your school this spring to start the school year really is the game plan for the school year. And it really sets the tone for how do we go about meeting students' needs and utilizing our resources in the most efficient way possible. So that's been, work that we've developed as a group from September and now to June. It's crazy to think. And I think it's fair to say schools are at totally different levels in where we started, and we're still at different rates, but we're working towards, those common systems and structures that are going to support students, support their academic growth, behavior support, and social emotional learning. And that, if you can remember, ties really back to our budget work as well in the beginning of the year, with a focus on academic support teachers, social workers, instructional coaching. So that's been really direct work. And it's kind of cool to think that in June, we're going to be actually kind of sharing our game plans from each school. So that's coming up. EST development, and I can share more specifics at the following meeting, but I'm proud to say that we have developed a common supervisory union protocol for how we go about our work with educational support teams. So we've laid the foundation to start that common protocol next school year. And what we did this year is we kept these 2 items on the agenda every single month with the idea of developing best practice, looking at research, and then also sharing the different elements that schools had in place at their school. So we've made the commitment to let's identify what we think is best practice, and let's hold the expectation that every school will have that in place as we start the school year next year. So we have done that, and we have developed a common supervisory union EST forms as well. So now, any school that your child may be in, or that you teach at, the EST form and process will be probably not identical, but extremely similar, and the paperwork will be identical. So when you transition from one school to another, from an elementary school to the middle school to the high school, instead of every school having their own documentation, which is how we started this school year with, every school will have common documentation. So I'm excited about that, and we can share that at the next meeting. Diversity, equity work, incredible work being done this year. We've shared at multiple meetings. Last week, Michaela organized 2 team planning days at the retreat farm. So all the DEI coaches and team leaders had those 2 full days to work on identifying common standards for next year, to implement next year in all of our schools. Administrators spent half of a day with that team participating in the development of identifying those common standards. So as we work on our recovery plan and tweak our recovery plan for next school year, when we start the school year, those common identified standards are going to be right in our recovery plan. So those first couple of staff meetings to start the year, we're laying the foundation. These are the expectations. This is what we're working on. Here are the standards. Let's work on how these can be reflected throughout all of the classes in our building. So kind of broad share out, but we wanted to highlight some kind of big picture work that we've done this school year. And I think it's exciting. The EST, the commonality for that is really exciting. And everybody working towards MTSS is also a really nice development. So our recovery plan will reflect next steps. So we'll also be in June reflecting on our accomplishments, but also what are the areas we did not meet and how do we set new goals. So it's hard to believe that June is a couple of weeks away, and it's been a heck of a year. So it's a nice feeling, actually.
So, okay, it sounds like a great plan. You're going to assess goals that you didn't meet, perhaps that you surpassed. Could you speak more about how you're assessing that? How you're assessing academic achievement and how you're assessing social and emotional learning?
Yep.
And just speak more about assessment.
Well, it'll be through, talking with each other, sharing successes. It'll be through use of data, looking at academic student data. As was shared last meeting, we did a climate survey in the fall. We'll be completing another one within the next couple of weeks. So by the time we get to June, we'll have the pre and the post data. And those will be sources that will help, guide our work and guide our goal setting for moving forward.
Could you say more about what data, especially academic data, you're looking at? What student achievement data? And also, so Panorama measured school climate. Panorama also has pedagogical surveys. Do we use those pedagogical surveys by Panorama?
I'm not a Panorama pro. I don't know if Paul is here remotely.
He was.
Yes, Paul Smith. Tim, I think I wasn't quite sure I heard you. The pedagogical surveys, no, we are, the three surveys that we use are the student climate survey, parent climate survey, and the teacher perception of student survey.
Okay, and just one more, if I may.
Sure.
Last meeting, you gave us a summary of the Panorama surveys. Can we receive the full entire report?
Yeah, I think that's next.
Okay.
If the question is with respect to the student climate survey, is that the question?
All three, actually.
Okay, and by full report, do you mean, I'm just sort of wondering what's the scale at which, because we've got, say in the student climate survey, 16 questions for the grades 3 to 5 survey, 18 questions for the 6 to 12 survey. So for each of those questions, there are demographic breakouts in various forms. There's grade level breakouts. That's a lot of different ways to slice and dice the data.
Okay.
In addition to sort of any comparisons that you want to make for those questions for which we can use national data to compare. So getting a little bit of guideline on what would be a reasonable thing to present would be really helpful.
I'll refine my question and submit it to our chair, and this will be discussed at our next meeting. Or
Either
future.
the next one or a future one, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
One of the ways to, and I've been thinking about this, one of the ways maybe to go would be to identify a couple of questions that are particularly of interest for a sort of a deeper dive. So what you got before was an overview, but there may be questions that are burning questions for the board that we could dive into a little bit more without overwhelming the board with, 16 different ways to slice and dice the data. Just a thought.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
I'm a little curious. I find it crazy that, like, with the EST work, that there hasn't been a uniform process across the district preceding this. I guess it must have been individualized before the merge. Is it how varying of differences can that be? Is it just paperwork? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think paperwork, practices, roles that we've identified, even like time of day that meetings happen. And I think those will still be variables in terms of times of days, but certainly roles that have been identified. Each school had their own paperwork, their own process. And, we felt like we needed to systemize that.
Yeah.
And that was, work that I just articulated, but I think it was really helpful for us moving forward. Being committed to what we have identified as best practice. Yeah. I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
I think standardizing what we are doing in terms of forms and format is really important for parent understanding. Mm-hmm. And it gives them a stage to work on that's K-12. So that it's not a constant relearning process, because students change schools at least twice, on many 3 times, and it's just it's a huge undertaking, to realize my child has needs that aren't being met, and I need to help the team figure out how we meet my child's needs, but it's also a huge undertaking for staff and for the child themselves. And so and mostly for the child themselves. So it's really important that everybody understand and everybody be on the same page. And that it just means that, if there's a plan that's developed at Oak Grove and the student moves to Putney will get the plan and they'll know exactly what has gone on.
I think another thing we've discussed as an admin team for a goal moving forward is marketing this work as well and making it available so parents know that if they have a concern, this is a really great avenue to get support from the school, to get a focused meeting on that concern and to develop a plan. And I think we have a lot of work to do in that area. But that's certainly something we've identified that we need to start the school year with next year. And I think with a new website, there's opportunities for a lot of that as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I think most people would probably be really surprised that we don't already have that in place and don't probably understand the amount of work and organization and what it would take to bring that together to create a bigger system process. So thank you for taking that on.
We're realizing as we've come together that for years, every school's kind of had their own system for a lot of things. Hiring, whether it's hiring, all kinds of different things. And of course, each leader has a different style too. So we've started to take which things are priorities and, whether the hiring, we've created a new hiring kind of centralized procedure. And so, but those things are a lot of work and we're getting there. EST was another step, so.
Can I just jump in from the Zoom for a second? I don't know if anyone can hear
Can
me.
you identify yourself, please?
Sure. This is Liz Dimmick, Elementary Special Ed Coordinator.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to jump in and say that one of the major things about really looking deeply at our EST systems is that it's had a big impact on our special ed referrals as well, because there have been inconsistencies over time around how students get referred for special education. And so it's just another way that we're tightening up the processes across the district for more consistency and continuity.
It's a really important point, Liz. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
And I just want to say, as somebody who sits on the leadership group, I think we owe Liz a huge thank you because she has done a ton of work on this, and she's created a lot of the forms, and she's just really done a great job of leading us in the process.
Absolutely.
What is her last name again?
Dimmick.
Well, Liz, apparently thank you is in order. So thank you very much for your assistance with that. Are you, anything else on your?
I think Deb Gass had something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. Thanks for squeezing me in the agenda. This is an opportunity that I certainly didn't want to get away from us. And so let me start by telling you that as part of our regular inspection of the Canal Street fire escape about a month ago, we discovered that the fire escape stairway had actually deteriorated to the point that it was detached from the building. And when our own facilities coordinator went up to inspect it, he fell through the stairway. He was unharmed, but we immediately realized that we needed to bring the experts in to tell us, to assess the damages and to talk to us about the repair costs. It was very difficult to find an agency or a business that actually deals with this, but we finally did find A+ Fire Escape and Repair Company out of Haverhill, Mass, who came and once again, when they inspected the fire escape stairway, their own inspector fell through the one of the steps. So we needed to swing into immediate action and asked for a bid, and the bid gave me sticker shock, but all in all, there are actually 2 fire escape stairways at Canal Street that need to be repaired and basically reconstructed. And that would come, there were two options that were included in the proposal. One was with a 5-year warranty, the other was with a 10-year warranty. And also included in that bid was a recommendation that we construct sort of a rooftop awning over the stairwells to prevent this from deteriorating so quickly in the future. All of that comes to the tune of about $81,000. And at the same time, just this week, I learned that our Head Start federal regional office in Boston is sitting on emergency one-time funds for health and safety concerns. And I reached out to our fiscal specialist and shared this issue. And she encourages us to apply for those one-time monies. And so that's why I'm here before you tonight, to get your permission to do so. And our fiscal year actually ends, along with that of the district, June 30th. So we want to capture these funds and incorporate them in our existing budget and be able to get the job started. So I'm asking for your permission to submit the application to the Office of Head Start Region 1 for funds to do the repairs along with the 10-year warranty option of the 2 fire escape stairways and build the rooftop over them at Canal Street.
So moved as described.
Second.
So Sean has moved it and David has seconded it. All those in favor of approving Deb Gass making the application as she has stated, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you, Deb, for bringing that to our attention.
Deb, did you have something else?
No, I mean,
I thought I heard your voice.
no, that was it. Thanks.
Thank you. Did you have anything else, Mark, on the admin report?
No, I don't.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I guess it's on to Frank.
Okay, I've handed out a financial statement. It's something that was sent out last week. It's a year-to-date through April 30th, if you want to pass that down. So this is for the Southeast School District, the first month of the last quarter. So it's the period ending April 30th. So I'll review it kind of briefly for you, and glad to take any questions. We did go into quite a bit of detail at the Finance Committee this evening earlier at 5, and had a good discussion about the financial condition of the district. But if you go to the end of the document here on page 10, just to kind of get to the summary. So we started with our $52 million budget, and that first column at the bottom there in approved spending by the electorate for this fiscal year that ends in June of 2022. We've done a great deal of work to access approximately $4 million worth of additional funds through primarily the ESSER grant. But Nancy Weiss has done a great job also pursuing other non-ESSER funds to support our students. So you see the second column there, the adjusted budget, 56 million. So that's the additional 4 million that I'm referring to. Year to date, you see,
just briefly, where does that show? I mean, our revenue still is the same in both of those. So where is that?
So I'm looking at the expenditure statement I just
at the very end. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is no revenue.
It's expense summary, not revenue summary.
Yep, this is all expense.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Usually the revenue's at the top.
Yeah, this is just expense. So year to date, spent 41 million through the end of last month, and we have 11.8 million in encumbrances, which primarily is payroll and benefits. So when you take 41 million in the nearly 12 million in encumbrances, subtract that from the $56 million budget, that leaves us that 2.8 million you see on the budget balance column, or 5%. So that's for the remaining month of June and the remainder of course, May, the month of May, to sustain operations. But again, keep in mind that the encumbrance is showing our commitments through June 30. So it's not like we're going to operate on 2.8 million for 2 months. It's what is at this point we haven't issued purchase orders for. So overall, we are in good financial position relative to our budget plan. As you look through this report, you'll see pluses and minuses, but overall, I do think that we're going to be in good fiscal shape at the end of the year. Some of the themes that you do see when you look through the pluses and minuses at the site level are areas for student support services. We, in a few areas, exceeded the budget. That reflects that commitment to the social workers, the contact tracing, the nursing services, so many of the things that were still necessary as with the pandemic evolved throughout this past year. But overall, I think we have favorable budget variances that will likely offset that. One last reminder, this report, it follows the format of our budget development. So it's organized first by school. So every page starts with a school location. Those numbers are assigned by the agency of ed, so that's why they're in the order that they are in. And then the next sorting convention is the funding source. So the first group of accounts there is all the locally funded programs, and it says local total. And then, like, if you look at page 1, in the middle of the page, if you look at the academy budget, 6.19 million local total on that first column, right in the middle of the page. That's the locally funded budget. And then the balance of the data there below that is the federally funded programs that I mentioned, we work very hard to secure. And then, of course, follow the rules around procurement so that we don't have to give the money back. The next convention here is it's organized by program, which means direct instruction, food service, after school programs, that sort of thing. And then we have grade level, and the last sort function is function, which is direct instruction, student support services, administration, so on. That's the organization of this report. It aligns with the budget document that's on the website and what we deliberated over this most recent winter and spring. So that's the expenditure side. The revenue side, we are again reasonably in line with budget projections. The largest receivable that we have is from the State Education Fund, and it's actually the town of Brattleboro's tax payment is due, I think it was yesterday, by the citizen, and the town has 20 days to pay us. So that's about $2 million. But in general, I expect our revenues to be closely in line with the plan. A last point of reference for you is the balance sheet. So that's our most important fiscal measure of solvency. It's the accumulation of all transactions for the history of the organization, which doesn't go that far back. That would be July of 2019. But our assets are 9.8 million. By the way, these are all the reports I sent you last week. 9.8 million in assets. Most of that is cash in the general fund, and then 3 million in liabilities, which are the claims against those assets. So the difference between assets and liabilities is about 6 million. That's obviously a very solvent and favorable position as at this point in the fiscal year. Another balance I'll just mention is our capital project reserve. Balance sheet there reflects 2.6 million in fund balance. Our target to close the year, if you referred back to the website and looked at the capital plan, our target was 2 million. So we're a little favorable on that, but we have some significant projects under construction and in the bid cycle right now. So that's the fiscal report. Any questions?
Maybe if you could talk a little bit about the scholarship funds. You mentioned that.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't mention another fund that we have is the Endowment Fund. The fund balance, it started at 6.6 million. As you, I'm sure, know, the stock market has has contracted this past year, and we are still approximately 6.1 million. So we've had some diminishment of our fund balance, but the professional money managers, Edward Jones, Wells Fargo, and People's Wealth Management have done a terrific job over the last 8 years that I've been associated with their management. So the market appreciation far outweighs this cycle, and this is not an unusual thing to see. We have the ups and downs in the market. Because of previous excellent returns, I think in general, the awards will be able to be sustained. Certainly the larger awards like the Ames Fund awards will be able to be sustained at our historical levels. There are some of our funds where the trustee who gave us the money says it shall only be interest dispersed for the period, and of course we have to honor that, and that will be an effect on those awards.
As I always do in the getting towards the spring, I just want everybody to be aware of the value of the Ames Fund for students from BUHS. Anybody that is interested in art can apply, and it's a tremendous asset for this community. And luckily it's been fully utilized for the last couple of years, and I think it's very important for administrators and staff and students to be aware of that so that everybody can avail themselves of those funds.
It's a $3,000 award to 3 students each year, and it's sustained for 3 years. So it's I'm sorry, $6,000. I think I said 3. It's $6,000 a year per student, 3 students for 3 years. The other thing that I wanted to report on that we covered in the Finance Committee is just a very kind of a brief update on our capital plan. So we have, this capital plan that the board approved back in January, also on the website. It's also in this nice annual report. I mentioned a few meetings ago, we have 38 projects for fiscal year 23, and we have about the same number in the fiscal year 22. We only have a few of the fiscal year 22 projects left to implement. Maybe one notable one is the HVAC improvement for the Guilford School. We did half of the school back in 2020 when the pandemic first hit, and the funding sources are just becoming available to us. We hope to finish that in 22, meaning June. Unlikely that that will happen, but we will make sure that those funds follow the project as we go into fiscal year 23. We are doing the same thing for the academy unit ventilators. So we're working with engineers now to finalize the bid package, which will need to be distributed in a bid opening either late May or early June. We also have a cooling system project here at VAMS, right over there at VAMS, scheduled for this summer. That it's in the queue for the application process. Window projects, there's a number of projects that will be designed and set up for bid in the next several weeks. So we are working very hard to get these vendors lined up, design work done, all the procurement requirements met. Which leads us to a discussion we had at the end of the Finance Committee in terms of just assuring that we can move forward in June, July, August, with with, maybe in the absence of a board schedule. So we needed a mechanism to facilitate that.
Yeah, so we were thinking maybe at the next meeting, it would sort of be like personnel hiring, in that actually the responsibility of accepting these bids and moving forward in a timely manner would fall on the business office. So if there would have to be a motion at the full board level, maybe in the first meeting in June.
Those projects are exciting.
Yeah, they really are. The Academy Addition project it's a full form now. You can enter in a building and see the spaces. It is intended to be occupied in September. Things are on budget and on schedule despite tremendously challenging supply chain obstacles. Our All Seasons Construction has just been a terrific partner. Stevens and Associates have done a great job helping to address problems, and Nadev Malin has been right there with us on the energy conservation and energy efficiency objectives that you must remember from the many discussions we've had. So it's really been successful so far.
Can I just clarify, are we thinking, maybe because I left the finance meeting on Zoom at home to try to get here in person and a little late, so maybe I missed something. Were we thinking that we would we would take it up at the next meeting since it's not on the agenda and ask the board to consider authorizing the business office to approve these, or to have it run by the finance committee so that we're all on the same page? I don't have a preference.
Is fine with me as long as the finance committee knows they can convene probably a number of times over the July and August period, because they have 38 projects. Almost every one of them needs a bid process.
So I think our conclusion at the finance committee meeting that just this evening was the most expeditious way to do it would be to have the central office have the authority to move forward with these projects as they arise, so that there's no stumbling block in, relaying that to the firms, the vendors, and so forth.
Yeah.
We also discussed, of course,
Just want to point out we're past where we would normally take a bio break. And so if you wanted to continue that, and we have one more item, but which we might be able to wrap up. And if that's going to be on the agenda, you could take it up then rather than now.
Sure.
Great. Do we have more than the
No,
one?
it looks like we just have the one last item.
Great.
Okay, so we have a school impact questionnaire, Act 250. Familari Farm would like to construct a facility to expand their hemp business to a legal cannabis business. This would not affect the school district in terms of students or population. It's just literally extending the business that they currently have on the farm and adding another facility. I believe this is a sheet that I fill out and submit back to the town. I think the board votes on it, or is it just informative?
To approve it, I think.
Yeah.
Can you clarify a little? So a business is just changing and then they have to go through the schools for us to acknowledge?
Sometimes they bring in more employees and need housing or need to put people in the schools. So Act 250 makes them run it by the school system whenever there's a significant development.
Act 250.
They're also right next to the high school.
So if like a high-rise
They're right
apartments
there.
went in, we would want to know so we could plan for an increase in
Okay.
It spoils our view
Yeah.
of the interstate.
So where are they looking to expand?
Way up on the hill on Familari Farm.
So now, don't you have like fields up there, the athletic stuff? Is it anywhere near that, or is it?
Not fields that we own.
No.
No, but is
They let us
it,
use
I'm
it.
just curious, is that what they're expanding, is it far enough away from where the students would be using the fields? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. Well, do we have a motion to approve Mark signing the Act 250 School Impact Questionnaire?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
So David moved and Ann seconded. Do, all those in favor of approving the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. So unless I am mistaken, then I think we can ask Ann if she can help us with this last item.
Madam Chair, there being no further business before this board, I move that we adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned at 7:47.
Hey.